I'm an historian, and I've worked doing a lot of different things in history. And when I say that, I mean that I've always worked on history projects and have learned different kinds of history for what I needed. I've worked on medical history, I've worked on space history, I have done all sorts of things. And so when I've gone somewhere, I've learned whatever there needed to be learned. So when I came to Cliveden, this is a historic site with 5.5 wooded acres and a lovely, huge colonial building filled with fabulous colonial antiques and teacups and things like this. It had been a historic site for 30 years before I even got there. And I sort of wondered what hadn't been looked up that I might be able to find that hadn't already been checked out in all of that time. But one of the things I learned was that the family, the Chu family, who had lived in the house from 1767 until 1970, all of that time, had collected its papers even from the 17th century until the present, just about. And many of these papers had been in Cliveden when the National Trust for Historic Preservation took over the building, took it as a gift. And these papers were eventually transferred to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And there were approximately 200,000 pieces of paper in this collection. There were even more that I found when I was at Cliveden. There were 80 shelf feet of things that we transferred down to the Historical Society, and I kept still finding paper. I would open a drawer and you could reach in and something of an unknown century would come out. Things from the 1700s, 1800s. And these things were constantly sort of coming out of the woodwork. And there was a list of the boxes of these things at the Historical Society. There were 280 some boxes, big bankers' boxes like this. And some of them had been well processed with folders in them, and you could tell what was in every one. Others just had a label on the box telling you what the box consisted of, but that was it. And all the people who had worked at Cliveden before me as a curator had been furniture historians and decorative arts people and things like that. I started out as a social historian, so I was always interested in ordinary people and their histories. And one of the things that I took an interest in early on was the fact that there was a history of some slavery in the Chu family history. And the three things we knew were, one, that in 1780 the Chu family had to declare the number of enslaved people that they owned. This was part of a law that had been passed by a radical government during the middle of the American Revolution. And they had declared 14 people. Another thing was that we knew that Richard Allen, who had founded the AME Church, had actually been born as a slave of Benjamin Chu. Later went on to, his family was sold to a neighbor, and then later he went on to buy his freedom, and then go on to his path to found the church. And finally, we knew that there was a place called Whitehall, a plantation that the Chus had owned, although we didn't know where it was. And when I was going through the list of these boxes one day, I discovered that there were 3 boxes that were labeled Whitehall. And so I went down to the Historical Society one day when I had some time, and I started opening up these boxes, and they were just filled with piles of folded up pieces of paper with little ties around them. This is how you file things in the colonial days. And I started going through them, and very unusual things started coming up right away. One of them was a letter from someone to Benjamin Chu, giving a report about agriculture and then saying, you have to come and help me right away. The Negroes are going to kill me. And this was not anything that I was familiar with. And it certainly didn't sound like the sort of relationships with enslaved people that I was familiar with. So it was surprising. And as it progressed over the next year or 2 years, I found a whole string of letters like this in which there were accounts of violence on the plantation, usually against the overseer. And it took a long time to figure out what was going on with all of these, but we did figure it all out. And the story was essentially this, that, well, I'll go back just for a little bit. We did also find a map of Whitehall, and a few clues as to roughly where it was. I mean, it was in Delaware, and it was roughly near Dover and Smyrna, because they would go to those places for side trips or for supplies. And one 3-day weekend, I did go down with this map, which had a river on it. And I bought a map of the county, and I sat down in a diner, and I just looked to match up the shape of the river with the current map. And it turns out it took 5 minutes at the most, and I actually was able to drive right over to it. And it turned out that the plantation was just adjacent to the Bombay Hook Wildlife Center. And I was able to get out of the car and walk around on the plantation. And I went into the Wildlife Center and talked to them. And they told me I could go down to a place where the old landing used to be. And it was really spooky because there were definitely ghosts rolling barrels down to this landing. And it's a very haunted sort of spiritual place where all of these people had been. Up to 60 there were there by 1800. And I've been back a lot of times and taken some people there, and it has a big impact on people.